The title of my presentation is The Tepper Story, and that's deliberate. It's not intended to be a richly researched academic paper. Sorry, Jeff. I wanted rather to deal with several aspects of the Tepper family and do it in story form. Like most stories, this story has its twists and turns, its ups and downs. But hopefully, like most stories, it has some fascinating surprises along the way and some interesting insights for you tonight. Some of you will be familiar with the Tepper story, at least in Australia. I know there are Tepper relatives in the audience today who certainly know about the family. But hopefully even they will find out something new along the way. And my intention is also not to create a full family history tonight, or a tree. That was done very comprehensively by Rosemary Martin, who wrote a book, The Tepper Family History, which was excellent. There's a copy over there if you want to have a look at it later, with the Tepper shield there that you might like to have a look at later. It was well written and richly researched, but because the book was produced in 1986, Rosemary was not able to draw on recent internet sources, so hopefully I'll be able to fill in a few gaps and answer some questions which she left back at that time. But I can't cover all the branches of the Tepper story, so I can only deal with snippets. I sincerely apologise to any family members who feel like they've been left out. But for me, it's been a thrill of the chase that's kept me going on this. I have a sneaking suspicion that one of the things which draws us all here together tonight is that exhilaration which comes from discovering something new and exciting about our family or about our links with the past, and then being driven to share those insights. That's the thrust of tonight's presentations. And most of this new information has come since 2010 for me, when my wife Chris and I visited Warsaw and visited Poznan, the former Prussian province of Posen. Most of the resources I've drawn on are websites, as well as the Google product for creating family trees called myheritage.com. You might be interested in that one. My Tepper connections stem from my maternal grandmother, Alma Leski, nee Tepper. Her father, Paul Tepper, who was born in Neutomischel in Posen and is pictured here with his wife, Christiana, was one of 9 siblings. And he had 7 more half-siblings. While Alma, his daughter, was one of 10 children in her family. So you can see how quickly the family grew. Alma was a most beautiful person, the most positive person I've ever met. Here she is in 1986 with 2 of her sons, Elmore, Uncle Elmore, who's here tonight, and my late father, Everard, right on the right, at her childhood home in Corombi near Matoa, a major centre of Tepper settlement. She was a wonderful gardener and an amazing musician. At the age of 95, when she was in Glindholm, when we would visit her with our young children, she would always want to play songs for the children in the hall. She would go to the piano, and she was partially blind by then, proceed to play a range of children's songs for the kids to sing without any music. And invariably, halfway through, she would stop and say, "That's too high," and immediately change key and play the song perfectly in a different key. What a talent. She died in 1990 at the age of 98. She and her twin sister, Minna, contracted cholera in early childhood. Alma survived, but her sister died at the age of 2. So our family often commented that between them they made their tongue. She's pictured here, second from the left, at Bathurst migrant camp in 1949. Next to her is her husband, Gotthold Adolf Leski, my grandfather, sometimes called John, especially during the xenophobia of World War II. He was a Lutheran pastor at Rainbow, Victoria from 1913 until 1956, virtually his whole ministry. He was one of the first class of pastors to graduate from Concordia College Adelaide in 1912, one of the so-called 12 apostles. because there were 12 graduates who graduated on the 12th of the 12th, 1912. The only time in his ministry when he was away from Rainbow was in 1949, when this fucker was taken at Bathurst migrant camp. He used his German language skills there to minister to displaced persons who were settling into life in Australia after the war. Alma and Pastor Lesky are standing next to Elsa and Martin Niemöller in the centre. Pastor Martin Niemöller, a decorated German World War I U-boat captain, who became a Lutheran pastor after World War I in Germany, became a vocal critic of Nazism and a defender of the confessional church in the 30s, and was imprisoned by Hitler in Dachau concentration camp for 5 years. He visited Australia in 1949 for a lecture tour. Many of you may have heard of him, but I'm sure everyone here recognises these famous words of his. They are known around the world. And they are feted at Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem. Investigating the Tepper family started out as a side issue when I was trying to find the origins of my Lesky forebears in South Australia, so just bear with me a little bit. That in itself was a difficult undertaking because the name of Johann Gottfried Lesky II, my great-great-grandfather, does not appear among the passenger lists of any boats bringing migrants to South Australia. It was only when the strong connection with the Gruenwald family was confirmed that the pieces fell into place. Using Poznan records, like this one, I discovered Johann Gottfried Lesky II had married Johanna Juliana Gruenwald in Neu-Tomischel, same town where the Teppers came from, modern-day Novi Tomisch, on June the 24th, 1849. From this, we gleaned that Johann Gottfried Lesky was not named in passenger records because he was included in the Gruenwald group led by Juliana's parents. When they emigrated from Hamburg, they arrived in South Australia on January the 17th, 1850 on the ship Emmy, the same boat which brought the well-known Seppelt family to South Australia. The Lesky family came from Neu-Tukotze, a tiny, tiny village in what was then the Prussian region of Posen. And I need to clarify here that the Lesky family, which came to South Australia from Neckler Holland on board the ship the Heloise in 1847, seems not to be closely connected with Johann Gottfried Lesky, in spite of endless speculation to the contrary. The two groups of Leskys came at different times on different boats from different towns in Posen, not terribly close to each other, settled in different towns in South Australia and didn't have any apparent contact with each other in South Australia. And my study of Posen marriage records has not brought to light any connection between them either. At best, they were related distantly back in Posen, and the stories of Samuel Lesky's successful migration in 1847 may have encouraged Johann Gottfried to emigrate, but there's no documentary evidence of that connection. Among the many discoveries made about this young couple, my great-great-grandparents, Johann Gottfried and Johanna Juliana, who were making a new life in Australia, I discovered that there is an actual Lesky tree where they must have lived for a short time. It's on the outskirts of Burgwood. And I don't know how many times I've driven that road completely unaware of the existence of this family jewel right there. Though perhaps not quite as grand and as impressive as the Herbie tree, it's still special to me. So at this stage, I started to put a small Lesky family tree together on myheritage.com. And this is when I came to make some new discoveries about the Tepper clan. I included some of my Tepper forebears in the Lesky tree, which created what they call a smart match. When the website detects a name which is the same or similar to a name in another family tree, it notifies the two family tree builders. To my surprise, I found I had a name in common with another website. It was a Tepper website on the other side of the globe in the Netherlands. It had been put together by a Dutchman and a relative named Alla Tepper. His Tepper clan migrated to Holland in 1641 to a town called Colin, and not far from where he lives today. I'm dying to go and visit him and talk to him. His family tree contains over 100,000 Teppers. And our family, in fact, most Teppers in Australia are part of that tree. I've been in contact with Mr. Tepper, and I sent him a copy of Rosemary Martin's Tepper family tree history. He knew most of it already. From this source has come lots of interesting new information which has filled in many gaps in the story of the Teppers. The first reference he has found to a Tepper is to Jacobo Hinrich Tepper in 1391, and he was a writer in the court of the King of Saxony. The oldest known ancestor, though, is Wilhelmus Aaron Hindricus Tepper, 1396 to 1469, who was born in Königsberg, then part of Prussia, but now called Kaliningrad, and part of Russia, cut off from the rest of Russian territory by Lithuania. It's today Russia's only ice-free European coastal port. In Prussian times, this was an important centre of Prussian culture. One of his major discoveries was that the family Tepper was originally Jewish, and parts of the family still identify as Jewish. 18 Teppers from the region of Lithuania died in the Holocaust, and another 16 Polish Teppers were Holocaust survivors. Names which feature prominently in the very early generations of the Tepper tree are Aaron, Jacob, Sarah and Moses, all giving further indication of the Jewish heritage in the family. After the war, one branch of the family migrated to Israel and settled there. They're still there. This was not really even hinted at by Rosemary Martin's Tepper family history. She believed the family was Wendish. Of course, there is likely to be Wendish heritage, and my great-grandmother was Wendish in the family through intermarriage, but the idea of Jewish heritage wasn't previously known. Now let's take some time to let that sink in. It gels with some research Ian Henschke of ABC radio fame has also done. He is part of the winemaking Henschke clan, is very interested in his family origins, and has even visited the Klemzig church and met its Catholic priest, Father Bunash. In an article in the Advertiser, September 27, 2013, Henschke describes how a Jewish radio guest of his told him Henschke was a Yiddish name. He was then moved to have a DNA test to check out this idea and found he did have Ashkenazi Levite lineage on both his paternal and maternal sides. Now, question, does this mean there was much more contact between German and Jewish families in Poland than is often recognised and admitted? This seems a likely conclusion to me and deserves much more follow-up research. But unfortunately, I can't get into that tonight. Other Tepper's research has shed light on another intriguing theme in the Tepper story. The Teppers have spread far and wide across Europe and beyond. Descendants have been found in Russia, Lithuania, Hungary, Georgia, Belarus, Romania and the Netherlands, as well as many parts of the Germanic regions, including East Prussia, Saxony, Silesia, and of course the Poznan or Posen region, where the Tepper branch, to which I belong, settled. Our branch of the Teppers moved from Königsberg to the region of Posen and lived in the towns of Volstein, Zontok, and the newly established then town of Nowy Tomaszów, known as Nowy Tomish today. This doesn't even include the massive overseas migration of Teppers across the centuries to America, Australia, England, Israel, and South Africa. In fact, most Teppers live in the United States, and most of them are probably Jewish, if I go on some of the websites that I've found. The Teppers were clearly not afraid to move around. perhaps because of persecution or for social, economic or political reasons. For example, my forebear, Johann Christoph Tepper, who came to South Australia on board the Gellert in 1847 and settled in Hoffnungstal with his family, had actually moved from one part of Posen to another 2 years before he migrated. This move was partly because his relatives, who were not old Lutheran dissenters like he was, were still giving him a hard time over his old Lutheran beliefs. He left his hometown, Lord Thomas Shell, which is here, not too far from the capital of Posen, and moved to Samersheen here, not too far from modern-day Bydgoszcz or Bromberg. He stayed there for 2 years until the Oster Party decided to migrate to Australia. Such movement across Europe was common. It challenges the oft-quoted idea of the stability of our Lutheran forebears in Europe. People like Ted Egan in his old TV documentary Valleys of Hope emphasise what a huge wrench coming to Australia, South Australia was for the early Lutheran pioneers, because they had such a settled life back home. Have you heard that? That idea? It's not true. They were people on the move, crisscrossing Europe for religious, social, agricultural and political reasons for centuries prior to the Lutheran migrations to South Australia. They were anything but settled. Might be time to readjust that perception in the community. Now, the Jewish branch clearly intermarried with non-Jewish neighbours, because Teppers in the family tree now are found in many different churches and religions. Some Teppers became Lutherans, others Catholics, others Anabaptists, Mennonites. But my forebears were strongly Lutheran. And the best example of this is the famous banker, Piotr or Peter Ferguson Tepper of Warsaw. He is probably the most famous Tepper historically. His story is partly told by Rosemary Martin, but his connection to our family tree was not known at that time. Ulla Tepper's tree clearly connects him to the Australian Tepper clan. Now we know that my great-great-grandfather, Johann Christoph Tepper, who brought his family to settle in Hoffnungstal, was the great-grandson of Martin Matthew Tepper, if you can follow the diagram. Martin Matthew's sister was named Catherine Concordia Tepper, which is an interesting thing when you know the connections with our family in Concordia. She was Piotr Ferguson Tepper's mother. She married a Scot, William Ferguson, who had migrated to Poland, bore her son, but allowed another brother, the wealthy furrier Piotr Tepper Sr., to adopt their son, and he became Piotr Ferguson Tepper Jr. He built on his father's fortune and became one of the most wealthiest men in Europe. It's worth spending some time on Piotr Ferguson Tepper's story. He was a Lutheran who lived in the centre of Catholic Warsaw. He was wealthy. He lived in 3 palaces. But his Lutheran faith showed itself in a remarkable way. He was responsible in 1772 for convincing the Catholic ruler of Poland to allow the Lutherans in Warsaw to build a church for themselves. And that church is still there. That's it. It's a magnificent building. The king, Poland's last king before it was partitioned and disappeared off the map for nearly 100 years, I think, Stanislaus Augustus Poniatowski, agreed to allow it to be built on one condition: he'd be allowed to design it himself. So he was responsible for this large domed roof, which at the time, 1772, made it the highest building in Warsaw. In April 1825, quite a bit later, Frederick Chopin prayed for Tsar Alexander I in this church. And the ruler presented him with a diamond ring. Even today, it dominates the skyline. You can see the dome there. And amongst the Polish communist architecture around about. I took this photo of it in 2010, and it still stands out. At that time, I wasn't aware of the connection to the Tepper family of this building. I took it from the top of Warsaw's Stalinist Palace of Culture and Science, which you see in the background of the next image, down the bottom there. That's that big, ugly Stalin's gift to Warsaw, and I don't know what to do with it. One suggestion was to build tall buildings all around it so they couldn't see it. And this is the church, and that's the interior. Because of his prominence, one more thing. The church was largely destroyed in World War II, along with much of central Warsaw, thanks to Blitzkrieg in 1939 and the Warsaw Uprising in 1944. But like the King's Castle, it was rebuilt completely after the war. Because of his prominence, we know lots about Piotr Ferguson Tepper. He owned 2 palaces in the old city of Warsaw and a country estate called Falenti on the outskirts of the city. One was so significant culturally and architecturally, that's this one. When it was damaged in World War II, the government had it rebuilt entirely, and it now houses the offices of the World Health Organization. This one is called the Palace of the Four Winds. It has 4 sculptures on the posts around the outside fence. But it's also still referred today as the Tepper Palace. It was destroyed in the Warsaw Uprising in 1944, but was completely rebuilt. However, his other palace in central Warsaw is even more famous. It also went by the name Tepper Palace. It was a short distance from the former and was in Miodowa Street, one of the prime areas of old Warsaw. It was damaged so severely in the war it was not able to be recovered. But fortunately we know what it looks like because of a portrait that was painted by the famous Italian landscape painter Bellotto. He painted lots, also known as Canaletto. His paintings are now in the Royal Castle in Warsaw and provide crucial evidence in that painstaking process of rebuilding the old city. So that's a treasured painting. The Tepper Palace, the other one, is this one here with the towers. It was owned by the Teppers in the late 18th century, but a Jewish family which owned it 80 years ago described it as a building in a figure-8 shape with gateways in the centre to allow wagons to enter and use the central courtyards and go through. It's widely believed that Napoleon and his lieutenant Talleyrand used the Tepper Palace when the French army invaded some years after Piotr Ferguson Tepper had died. There are rumours this is where the Polish noblewoman Marie Walewska seduced Napoleon. Now, this is probably apocryphal. Later on, in 1822, it was bought by Mikolaj Grabowski, father of Chopin's first youthful girlfriend. A cafe on the mezzanine floor called the Zierka, my Polish isn't too good by the way, was frequented by young romantics, including Chopin himself. The Tepper's country, this is the third one. The Tepper's country estate, Falenti, bought in 1787, was some 10 kilometres south of Warsaw. In World War II, it was used by senior SS and Gestapo officers for their accommodation, and is now the higher school of regional development. Tepper built a conservatory here and used it to breed flowers. Gardening and botanical interest, as we'll see later, has long been a favoured occupation of Tepper relatives. So this characteristic seems to have started very early in their history. Now some biographical details of Piotr Ferguson Tepper. And the source of this is an article by W. Rogowski called Ferguson Tepper's Falenti. He was one of the richest men in Poland and was called the second banker of Europe and is still remembered in Poland today. References to Tepper are common in tourist guides of old Warsaw. He was born in Poznan, then Posen, in 1732. His adoptive father, Piotr Tepper Sr., was a furrier and fur trader, but soon moved to Warsaw, where he worked as an accountant and shareholder. Taxes in Polish territory at the time were 6 times lower than in neighbouring Prussia, which favoured these local businessmen, a growing middle class. Tepper Sr. supplied the Polish nobility with expensive imported goods, and he founded the first department store in Poland. Whoops. Sorry. When banking was freed up in Poland by the king in 1775, Tepper developed his financial interests, and his adopted son Piotr Jr. took over and developed a real financial cartel. He married Maria Filipina Valentin in 1763, and 2 of his daughters married into wealthy families, and the businesses worked together to grow further. His banking house developed contacts in Amsterdam, Berlin, St. Petersburg and Vienna. The Polish king was their main client. Tepper lent him money to pay for the Polish army, for example. The king in turn favoured Tepper. The Teppers entertained the king royally at their country estate Valenti in 1788, and soon after the 2 Piotrs were made Polish noblemen. At this time, the fortune was at its height and was valued at 65 million złota. I'm told that's how it's pronounced, Polish currency. Now, if we equate at that time a Polish cavalryman's pay of 1,200 złota per year, with an average soldier's pay today of say $60,000 a year, that's equivalent to 3.2 billion Australian dollars. Because of his Ferguson connection, he was also recognised in Scotland. In fact, and I'm not making any of this up, it's true. In fact, he and his wife were named as the guardians of the children of Bonnie Prince Charlie's illegitimate daughter Charlotte, when she died young. Piotr and his wife had 10 children of their own at that stage, so what's a couple more? But I'm sure you can guess where the story goes. The king was increasing his borrowings dangerously. Poland lost territory in the first partition, and then the king surrendered in the Polish-Russian War of 1792. He was increasingly just a puppet of the Russian Tsarina Catherine, and the second partition, which lost more territory, was signed on January 23, 1793. Political unrest led to a massive run on the banks. Tepper's request to a Berlin bank, to the Prussians, for credit was rejected for political reasons. They were opponents, really. And news of his insolvency spread like wildfire. 18 million złota was demanded, and on February the 25th, he officially went bankrupt. And 6 other banks followed suit, so it was a terrible time for Poland. In the following year, 1794, the failed Kosciuszko uprising. You all know about him because he gave his name to our highest mountain. Kosciuszko we say, but they say Kosciuszko. Took place in protest at Poland's loss of freedom and sovereignty in Warsaw. Probably led by creditors at the bank, Tepper's home, his department store and his bank in Miodowa Street were attacked. He defended his home but was wounded and died soon after on April 26, 1794. So that's his grave in Warsaw. And that was the end of his Miodowa Street empire. It didn't live up to its name, by the way. Miodowa in Polish means honey. His wife had died in 1792 and the 10 children spread out across Europe. The Teppers once again were forced to move. Over the next 10 years, all his palaces and property were sold up. Now, I just want to focus a little bit on his children. He had 10 children and many portraits of them survive. So let's have a look at some of them. This is the oldest child, Henrika Katerina, who married the banker August Wilhelm Arndt in 1780. Next is Charlotte Rosa, who died in 1784 in Kiev. Her husband, Baron Daxt, was Minister for Prussia in Warsaw, in the government. She then married M. Milashevich, a colonel in the Russian military, hence her move to Kiev. The third daughter was Elzbieta Dorota, who married the banker Karol Schulz, so they were part of the firm. And the next photo we have is one of Daniel Frederick Tepper, born in 1772, followed by Anne Margaret, 1775, Anna Isabel, or perhaps Isabel Teresa, both names are in the sources, and she married Count Jan Henrik Swalodkowitz. 3 boys are not depicted, so mostly girls' portraits. But one deserves special treatment. That's the youngest child, Otto Walter, pictured here with his mother. An individual portrait of him hangs in the Royal Castle in Warsaw. That's it, up there with King George III and a few others. My wife Chris and I discovered it there by pure accident during a visit in 2010. I'll just tell you the story. We hadn't even planned to visit the Royal Castle, and the first time we walked by, it was shut. But we managed to pass again, return, and decided to have a walk around. And like all the other royal apartments around Europe, in Potsdam and Versailles and so forth, it was full of gold leaf tapestries, ornate mirrors, and dozens of portraits. That's what it looks like today. It's been completely rebuilt. It was destroyed in the bombing in the Warsaw Uprising. It's been completely rebuilt. So it was pure chance, going through all the rooms, that drew me to one portrait of a young boy and led me to read the caption, which was below. I was flabbergasted. It said, Walter Otto Ferguson Tepper, my distant relative. The quality of the photo leaves a lot to be desired, sorry, and that's no doubt because my hands were shaking. That's what history's fun, isn't it? This collection of This collection of portraits only came to light, apart from this one, in Devon, in England, in 2013. They were originally given to a Scottish cousin, Walter Ferguson, and stayed in the Ferguson family. He lived in Edinburgh after that. But the Historical Museum of Warsaw uncovered the collection and bought them all for £30,000 and put them on display, recognising their significance in showing the flowering of the Polish middle class in the 18th century and in showing the clothing and customs of the time. But the most famous of the children is not depicted in a portrait. He was the musician's son, Ludwig Wilhelm Ferguson Tepper. He is most well known for being the Kapellmeister and music teacher at the Russian Tsar's court, and for teaching piano at the Imperial Lyceum School in Tsarskoye Selo, just on the outskirts of St. Petersburg, where the Tsar had his estate, and for composing a range of classical works. He also taught the poet Pushkin to play the piano. Apparently his house in Tsarskoye Selo has survived. I think it might be a museum. I'd like to go there and check it out now. He studied in Stuttgart and Hamburg and was an excellent pianist. So when the family fortune first collapsed, he travelled Europe as an itinerant musician and composer, living in Berlin, Vienna and Prague, before finally settling in Tsarskoye Selo in Russia. This is one of his works, a setting of Schiller's poem Ode to Joy, later used by Beethoven. Now, just last year, an intriguing new theory about this piece has come to light through the research of someone called Michelle Rasmussen of the Schiller Institute. She believes Tepper could have been a mediator between Schiller and Beethoven, because these two men never actually met. Even though Beethoven later used Schiller's Ode to Joy, of course, in the glorious finale to his 9th Symphony. Schiller and Tepper went to the same school in Stuttgart, and they briefly met in October 1793, just a short time before Tepper went to visit Beethoven. He went to Vienna and he made friends with Beethoven as musicians. And Rasmussen even claims, and I quote here, Tepper and Beethoven also spent several days together in Prague, and one can read Tepper's humorous account of the time he and Beethoven almost drowned together while crossing a river in a coach. So Tepper was the first to write a setting of the Ode to Joy. So it's quite reasonable to think he may have encouraged Beethoven to use the poem. That's Rasmussen's theory. To any lover of Beethoven's music, let alone a relative of Tepper de Ferguson, as he calls himself now, because he was playing on his noble status to get work around the princely homes. This possible collaboration is intriguing and enthralling. Could a Tepper relative have inspired and encouraged Beethoven to write the famous Ode to Joy theme? I'll leave that one for you to ponder. Now we return to the Teppers of Neu-Thomaschel and Novi-Tomisch. The year is 1845, 21 years after the death of Ludwig Wilhelm in Paris. Ludwig Wilhelm's cousin's grandson, Johann Christoph Tepper, my great-great-grandfather, is feeling frustrated by the family dissensions owing to religious and church differences he has experienced. I'll leave you to read Otto Tepper's recollections of this time. Otto is Johann Christoph's oldest son, and he has produced this amazingly interesting diary of his life. Johann Christoph was living there with his wife, Johanna Wilhelmina nie Protsch, and their two boys, Johann Gottfried Otto and Johann Paul, my great-grandfather. Their first-born child, Matilda, had lived only a few months. Both boys were probably baptised in the church built by the old Lutheran dissenters, which once stood here. It's no longer there. The Teppers were faithful supporters of Pastor Oster and the old Lutheran cause. They had been excluded by this time from the Union Church in Neu-Thomaschel and Novi-Tomisch. Today it's a Catholic church because there are no more Germans in the area at all. That's just a building. That's from the era in Neu-Thomaschel and Novi-Tomisch, just to give you a feel for what it must have been like. So, because of family strife, the Teppers are on the move again. First to the Polish town of Samoshin, near Bydgoszcz, and they stayed there for 2 years, but eventually they came to South Australia. While at Samoshin, another son, Philip Nathaniel, is born. Now, the statement you just read before clearly indicates that religious dissension in the family, stemming from their steadfast adherence to the old Lutheran beliefs, was the main reason for their migration to South Australia, even if it was well after the state religious persecution had officially ended in Prussia. Other pull factors were encouragement from their former pastor, Oster, and the financial help of George Fife Angus, while the push factor was the wet seasons they experienced after they shifted to Sappersheen. The family travelled by wagon to Bremerhaven via Berlin. Otto, in his autobiography, comments on seeing the Prussian King's Palace while in Berlin. Today, 169 years later, on this same spot, next to the River Spree in Berlin, the palace is being rebuilt. In 1976, that's the building that was there. The former communist East German government replaced the old Prussian palace with an asbestos-riddled building called the Palast of the Republik to house the Parliament of the German Democratic Republic. And you see it there with the Berliner Dom just adjacent. That's the reflective mirrors or glass. Now, by chance, I visited this spot 3 times, and it's looked different every time. December 1989, it looked like that. That was just after the Berlin Wall had come down. In fact, on the weekend I was there, about December the 26th, 3 million people went through the Berlin Wall. That, half built in 2015, and like that in 2010. They were still working out what they were going to do there. Someone put a heart shape on the grass. Here's the Spree River. Of course, this is the dome that I was standing up here taking that photo. It's well worth the climb. The journey with Pastor Oster's group on the ship to Gellet was not easy, as these original woodcuts from the Migration Museum in Bremerhaven show life in steerage, where the Teppers was difficult. Now I'll take some of the problems that were encountered from Johann Christoph's diary. Dangerous storms, lack of water for cleanliness, illness and death, loss of a sailor overboard, a cannon fire accident where a sailor lost his fingers, slow progress due to lack of wind, extreme heat below deck, and boredom were constant companions. Johann Christoph describes in his diary one storm. Then the storm struck us, but a storm at sea cannot at all be compared to a storm on land. Everyone for whom this was the first sea voyage was afraid and terrified. It is fearful but also wondrously beautiful to witness such a struggle between two elements. While the 30-foot high raging waves crashed with all their force against the ship, a nutshell in the great wide ocean, and threatening to capsize her, and the storm roared and whistled through the rigging and sails. Dense fog made the night, which was dark anyhow, as black as the grave. And nevertheless, the seaman, back on the rudder, had to stand like a marble figure, steering direct into the waves as the compass directed, ignoring everything that was happening around him. Often, too, had to operate the rudder, which is controlled by a wheel. And it has happened that they have been knocked over by the force of the rudder and almost thrown overboard. Even on our trip, we experienced this, and so they were secured by a rope. Still, this storm was fortunate for us, for it is from a favourable direction and drives us towards our distant goal. Johann Christoph handled the difficulties stoically. One example from his diary illustrates this. One of his 3 boys, born in Prussia, Philip Nathaniel, died during the voyage. His father describes this tragic event thus: "Last night we had our second death. Our youngest child died as we passed the Tropic of Cancer." That's all he says. Such brevity. He describes Pastor Oster's death in 23 lines. about something so emotional illustrates the determination of this man, I believe. Nothing was going to keep him from his goal of settling in Australia. He made it finally when the Gellert arrived at Port Adelaide on December the 21st, 1847. But his family's travels didn't stop there. They moved first to Bethany briefly and then joined the group who settled in the new village near Lindok, optimistically called Hofnungstal, Valley of Hope. As we all know, I think, here, this was the most ironic of names. In 1853, the area was flooded after several days of constant rain, and eventually the settlement was abandoned. Once again, they were forced to move. Initially just down the road to a new block on the road to Williamstown, now I think a vineyard belonging to the Zemlis, then briefly to a poor farm at Monato, and finally to a selection at Corombi in Victoria's Wimmera district. But initially at Hofnungstal, they settled well into their new life, erecting this cottage and outbuildings, which Otto, the oldest son, sketched. It also shows the vegetable gardens below. Contrary to what Rosemary Martin suggests, this home, based on Otto Tepper's description, was on the western side of Hofnungstal, not on the eastern side in the original settlement, as she indicated on her map of the area. She suggests this is the main street. Imagine that. The cemetery at top end, maybe a little bit further up here. And she puts the Tepper property here, but it's actually on the other side. This was the low-lying area that flooded. Life was busy there. So if this is the site of the church and the school, long building here. The Tepper property must have been over here somewhere. Nearly a year after their arrival in South Australia, a son, Johannes Daniel, was born to the couple, followed by the birth and early death of Christoph Martin Tepper and the birth of Wilhelm in 1852. Sons Otto and Paul, the older ones, were expected to mind the babies and perform their other tasks. Otto Tepper's wonderful memoirs paint a graphic word picture of their life. Imagine the scene around this little cottage as I read some of Otto's words. Our first livestock was fowls, then 2 goats with kids, which Paul and I had to mind carefully. Then in the second year, 2 cows, one with calf and the other said to be in expectation. The goats disappeared, we had to mind the cows instead. Father was much away during the daylight, excepting Sundays and holidays, but home for breakfast and tea time. Mother and I planted a fair-sized garden on rising ground. Oops. See it there. Which Father had dug perhaps before he went away to work for hire, all through our first year or longer. How Father and his partner, his name was Binky, got the land ploughed and sown I never learned. They wrecked the crop, thrashed with flails, cleaned and bagged conjointly, then to market somehow, while Father also stored the flour for the whole of the house. Thus our daily work proceeded. I from 8 o'clock after breakfast in school till 12 p.m. in that building. Among and with the older children, and after dinner helping Mother, or in the garden and attending to the livestock. Paul went to school in the afternoon from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. Then with him playing or working till the evening, getting in the cattle or milking, etc. And after supper, learning lessons, parts of the Catechism, Bible verses, tables, etc., reading storybooks, and the German newspaper Deutsche Zeitung, all in German print, very little English, yet understood by the children. Very little English, yet understood by the children or even women. Nearly there. Otto also helped with the domestic work, including watching the Sunday meal while his parents were in church. Johann Christoph often worked away for wages. The Tepper family, as before, had its ups and downs, and the Hoffnungstal flood, of course, was the most notable. Christoph's wife, Johanna Wilhelmina, died from typhoid fever in 1856, 3 years after the flood. Just over a year later, he married Maria Elizabeth Nee Hampel. She bore 7 children in Lindau Valley before the move to Corombi. 3 died as infants, so in all, 5 Teppers were buried at the Hoffnungstal Cemetery. I just want to focus finally, I have to come to an end, on 3 Tepper men, Johann Christoph and his 2 oldest sons, Otto and Paul. Apologies if I leave out the others. Otto is the most well known. As a child, he showed great curiosity and enthusiasm for learning, even though his family relied on him for farm work. As a child, he quickly learned English and ravenously devoured any books that he could beg, borrow or steal. He visited different areas in his role as a farm labourer and shearer and took these opportunities to investigate plant species and insects. Natural history was his thing. This would become his life's work. He was interested in botany, entomology, geology, music, developing his sketching skills to record new information. In 1867, he began work as a teacher, and like many in that profession, moved from school to school, district to district, and so managed to continue his scientific observation in different places. In 1883, he was appointed the South Australian Museum's natural history collector, and in 1888 was appointed entomologist, numismatist and librarian at the museum. He wrote several papers on the flora of different regions. Several plants and fungi have been named after him, including Dodonia tepperi, Helichrysum tepperi, and Stylidium tepperianum, endemic to the Kangaroo Island. He described 164 insect species, and some were named after him. He was also very civic-minded. Purchasing the original plot of land in Lindau, settled by founder Dr. Brown, he gifted it to the Barossa Council and is still a resident today. Johann Paul Tepper also had an equally interesting life, though not in the public eye like Otto. Like his older brother, he was an inquisitive collector and a traveller. He lived in his lifetime at Neu-Tomashel, Samusheen, Hoffnungstal, Lindau Valley, Minato and Corombi. In addition, as a young man, he spent a year when he sailed to the Northern Territory as second in charge of an expedition by a man named William Brock, which went to the Northern Territory. He had a great interest in plants, but was especially keen on insects, and brought back hundreds of bug specimens from that expedition. Several insects were named after Paul. Here we go. Hydrobiforma tepperi, Telephorus tepperi, and Dibolia tepperi, just to name a few. So education and inquiry, especially in the area of natural history, was Paul's passion, just like his brothers. But he did apply this to his work too. He selected suitable wheat varieties and bred his own variety, which won him a prize of a silver cup at the 1889 Paris exhibition. This cup was used in the baptism of my grandmother in 1892. Music for Paul, just like for Otto, was a big feature of the Paul Tepper home. Paul wrote hymn tunes, and the family enjoyed musical evenings together. Paul was also a faithful Lutheran, conducting mission rallies and gathering church dues around the Matawa area. The strong themes of plants, music and faith keep cropping up. Finally, there is the family patriarch. That's the best photo I could get. Johann Christoph Tepper. He too was an educated man, clearly. He wrote a diary right through his voyage. He wrote prayers. The family has a copy of his shipboard diary showing his command of language. And several prayers of his are in his writings. He was a leader in the Hoffnungstale congregation, but was very humble about his leadership responsibilities. Young Philip Oster, son of the pastor who passed away on the boat, for example, mentions in his diary entry for the last day before embarking from Bremerhaven, a very significant event, Father got Tepper to read aloud a solemn prayer. Christoph writes for the same event, a prayer was read, which the pastor had prepared. No mention of his own role in this important moment. He's a humble man. When Philip Jones, a curator at the South Australian Museum, tried to explain the wide range of Otto Tepper's scholarly interests in his article Colonial Wissenschaft, in a book that's over there, he suggests Otto's father benefited from a Humboldtian education, meaning Prussian education at the time was developed by Humboldt to combine research with study, arts with science, culture with science. Without doubt, Johann Christoph encouraged the scientific curiosity and the literary and musical talents displayed by his sons. I like to think those traits are carried on now, and right down in the musical talents, and the love of plants and gardens, and the intellectual curiosity of Tepper descendants today, especially my own uncles and cousins and their offspring. It's not surprising, I don't think, that there's quite a few Tepper descendants who have become teachers. One more thing. Johann Christoph also encouraged his son's wandering spirit. It's no surprise that the Hoffnungstale refugees called their new church St. Jacobi. St. James, or St. Jacobus in German, is the patron saint of pilgrims. Those people realised they were all pilgrims in this life. Travelling can be a difficult and dangerous business. Johann Christoph Tepper knew where to turn in difficult times. I'll end this paper with a prayer written by this man. Grace be to you all, the grace of our Lord, with whom we wander here below, and gladly look for his coming. On such a narrow path, we can indeed take no step except his grace accompany us to the very end. Thank you for listening.
And of course, well, you don't need me to tell you that it's enough to make any family historian green with envy. How green do I look? I've been envious of the Tepper family for a long time before I knew most of their story, because my ancestor, my Zweck ancestor, came out on the same ship, on the Gallet, and came from the neighbouring city of Bromberg or Bydgoszcz, very close by. Also did the same, settled in Hoffnungstale. My Zweck ancestor left not one sheet of paper with anything written on it. And so, well, instead of being envious, however, I think the better thing to do under those circumstances is to gratefully read every word written by those people who have lived through the same circumstances. And that I did. So I've known about this part of the story quite well. But I must say I became much more fascinated when I heard of these other far more exotic stories that Ev has told us tonight. And it's pointed out all sorts of things. There's Ferguson Tepper. The Fergusons, the Scots, they were all over Poland. We've got a couple of books in our state library here about the Scots in Poland. And of course, we've got our Scottish Mackenzies, who were also connected to Bonnie Prince Charlie. And Bonnie Prince Charlie's mum was a Silesian princess. So, godparents of my great-grandfather or one of his brothers or one of them, there were several Scots among those. So that is not a huge surprise. The fact that one can trace one's family back to the 1390 something, it is just too incredible for words. And to find that Jewish ancestry, and that is where I thank Ev very much for bringing this to our attention. But I'm looking forward to thanking him far more in a few more years when he's really researched this whole story of connections between Jews and Germans in Prussia, in Poland. There were many of them, of course, in Posen in particular. When Prussia took over Posen, it took over a huge Jewish population. That was the great concentration in that part of the world of Jewish families and Jewish settlements. And it would in fact be a very interesting story to go back and try to find real documentation of the coexistence of these people, of Germans, Jews and Poles together, all three of them it's a very interesting story there, and it would be one, you can come back any time when you've got that story to tell us.
10 years,
Thank you for the beginning of the story tonight. It's been wonderful. Thank you very much.